The message came from deep space, and it came with a threat wrapped inside a compliment. It arrived on a gray morning in Geneva, where the United Earth Council met in a tall glass building that overlooked a lake. The message had traveled for 6 days, at speeds no human engineer could yet build, carried by a courier drone shaped like a silver teardrop. It landed on the lawn outside the council building without asking permission, and it opened like a flower to project a hologram of a creature none of them had ever seen. The creature was tall, taller than any human, with skin the color of old copper, and eyes that glowed faintly gold. He wore armor made of overlapping plates, each one etched with symbols that seemed to shift and crawl when looked at too long. He stood with his hands behind his back, the posture of someone used to being obeyed. "I am Threxel Vaughn, King of the Korathi Dominion," the hologram said, in a voice translated into flat, accentless English, by machines humanity did not build. "I have watched your species for 3 of your years. You are young, you are loud, you fight among yourselves more than you build, and yet you have done something no other race in this sector has done in 1,000 cycles. You have survived contact with 3 hostile powers without being destroyed." The council members sat very still. Admiral Elena Reyes, the highest-ranking military officer in the room, felt her jaw tighten. "This has earned you my attention," Threxel Vaughn continued. "The Korathi Dominion is not cruel. We do not conquer for sport, but we test. Every species that wishes to stand among the recognized powers of this galaxy must prove itself. I have decided that Earth will be given this chance." The hologram paused, and somehow, even as a projection, the king's golden eyes seemed to look directly at each person in the room. "Here is my test. You will send me your strongest warship, not your fastest, not your prettiest, your strongest. The vessel that best represents the might of your species. It will meet my flagship at the coordinates I have provided, at the edge of your solar system, in 30 of your days. There, in a contest of strength, I will judge whether Earth deserves to be treated as an equal, or whether it deserves to be treated as a resource." The word resource hung in the air like a knife. "Refuse, and I will assume you are too weak to be worth testing, and I will act accordingly. Succeed, and Earth will have a seat at the table of powers. Fail, and Earth will belong to the Korathi Dominion, along with everything on it, and everyone in it." The hologram flickered, then vanished, leaving only silence and the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. For a long moment, nobody spoke. "Well," said Chairman Okafor, rubbing his temples, "that's certainly one way to start a Tuesday." The council argued for 6 hours. Some wanted to refuse outright, calling it an insult, a trap, a bluff. Others wanted to send the newest ship in the fleet, the Vanguard, a sleek cruiser bristling with rail cannons and shielded by the best composite armor Earth's shipyards could produce. It had been commissioned only 8 months earlier, and was, by every measurable statistic, the most powerful warship humanity had ever built. Admiral Reyes listened to all of it without saying much. She was 61 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of making decisions that got people killed or kept them alive. When the room finally quieted enough to hear her, she stood. "We don't know what Threxel Vaughn's flagship looks like," she said. "We don't know what weapons it carries, what its shields can take, or how experienced its crew is. We do know one thing about the Korathi, because our listening posts have picked up fragments of Dominion communications for the last year. They are old. Their empire has existed for over 4,000 years. They have fought wars we can't even imagine, against species that don't exist anymore because the Korathi ended them. So we send the Vanguard," said General Petrov, the youngest member of the council, a man who had made his career in fleet procurement and believed fiercely in the value of new technology. "Our best ship, our best chance." "The Vanguard is 8 months old," Reyes said. "It has never fired its weapons at anything but a target drone. Its crew has never lost anyone. It has never taken a hit it wasn't ready for. Against a 4,000-year-old empire that tests species by making them fight, I don't think newest and shiniest is the advantage you think it is." "Then what do you suggest, Admiral? We don't have a better option." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made half the room lean forward and the other half lean back. "We have the Resolute." There was a pause, and then someone laughed, not unkindly, but with genuine surprise. "The Resolute? Elena, that ship is 53 years old. It's a museum piece. It hasn't left orbit in over a decade. I know exactly what it is, Reyes said. I served on it for 11 years. I commanded it for 4 of those years, during the Belt conflict, when half the ships that flew beside it didn't come home, and it did, every single time. I know what that ship can do, and more importantly, I know who is still alive that flew her. Chairman Okafor frowned. Elena, I respect your history with that vessel, but this isn't about sentiment. Threxel Vaughn wants our strongest ship. By every technical measure, the Resolute is outdated. Its weapons are a generation behind. Its armor is a museum specimen. If this is truly a test of strength, sending an old warship instead of our best would be a message, Reyes cut in. The room went quiet again. Think about what he actually asked for, Reyes said, stepping toward the center of the room, her voice dropping into the register she used when she wanted people to really listen. He didn't ask for our newest ship. He didn't ask for our fastest ship, or the one with the biggest guns. He asked for the ship that best represents the might of our species. That's not a technical specification. That's a philosophical question, and I think we've been answering it wrong. She let that sit for a moment. The Vanguard represents what we hope to become. The Resolute represents what we already are. It was built during the Belt conflict, when we were fighting each other, when half of Earth's nations thought the other half wouldn't survive the decade. It was patched together with scavenged parts more than once. It's been rebuilt after 3 separate engagements that should have destroyed it. Its crew, over 5 decades, has included people from every continent on this planet, people who hated each other's governments and fought beside each other anyway. That ship has never once been the strongest thing in a fight, and it has never once lost. Petrov shook his head. Sentiment doesn't stop energy weapons, Admiral. No, Reyes agreed. But something else does. Come with me. I want to show you something. 3 hours later, the full council stood in a maintenance hangar at Farside Station, on the dark side of the moon, looking up at the Resolute for the first time in years. She was not beautiful. Her hull was a patchwork of gray and dull silver, scarred in places where new plating had been welded over old wounds that never fully healed. Her design was blocky, practical, built in an era before humanity understood elegance in space combat, back when every ship was designed by committee and built under wartime pressure with whatever materials could be found. She looked, Petrov thought, like an old dog that had been in too many fights and had somehow always managed to walk away. She doesn't look like much, he admitted. No, Reyes said, and there was something in her voice that might have been pride. She doesn't. Come on, there's someone I want you to meet. They found him in the engine room, a man in his 80s named Marcus Webb, sitting in a wheelchair beside a console that hadn't been touched in 10 years, wiping dust off a control panel with a rag, as if it were a daily ritual, and not something he'd decided to do on a whim that morning after hearing the news. His hands were spotted with age but steady. His eyes, when he looked up at the delegation walking toward him, were sharp as a hawk's. Elena, he said, breaking into a grin that took 20 years off his face. I heard the rumors. Took you long enough to come find me. Marcus was chief engineer on the Resolute for 31 years, Reyes told the council. If anyone alive knows what this ship can actually do, it's him. Marcus wheeled himself closer, looking up at Petrov with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and challenge. You're here because some alien wants your best warship, and you're wondering if this old girl still has teeth. That about right? That's about right, Petrov said. Marcus laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Son, let me tell you something about the Resolute. She was never the strongest ship in any fleet she flew with. Not once. Every single engagement she fought, she was outgunned, outnumbered, or both. And you know what she did every time? He didn't wait for an answer. She came home. Every crew that ever flew her came home, because the people who built her, and the people who flew her, understood something that a lot of newer ships forget. Strength isn't about how hard you can hit something. It's about how much you can take, and how creative you get when you're losing. This ship has 3 separate reactor systems, because someone during the Belt conflict decided one point of failure wasn't good enough. She's got manual overrides on every automated system, because someone decided computers could be hacked, but a person with a wrench couldn't. Her hull has 7 layers, instead of the standard 4, because after the second time she nearly died, the engineers who fixed her got angry. and decided it would never happen again. He looked directly at Petrov now, and there was nothing frail about the look. You want to send your king a ship that looks strong. Elena wants to send him a ship that survives. Those aren't the same thing. And if this alien king is even half as old and wise as you say he is, he'll know the difference the second he sees her. The vote came 2 days later, and it was close, 7-5, but it came down, in the end, to a question that Admiral Reyes had asked in the final debate, a question nobody could answer with confidence. If Threxel Vaughn is testing us, she had said, what is he actually testing? Our technology? He's 4,000 years ahead of us. There's no version of this where our best weapons beat his. He knows that. He has to know that. So what is he really measuring? Nobody had an answer. But enough of the council trusted her enough, and remembered enough of what the Resolute had done during the Belt conflict, to take the gamble. The order went out that evening. The Resolute would fly again. Marcus Webb cried when he heard, though he would deny it fiercely to anyone who asked. Within 48 hours, calls started going out across the globe, to retired officers and engineers and gunners who had once called the old ship home, some of them well past retirement age, some of them younger, having served on her final tours before she was mothballed. Not all of them could come. Some had died in the years since. Some were too old, too sick, too far away. But enough said yes. Enough packed bags and kissed grandchildren goodbye, and made their way to Farside Station, driven by something harder to name than duty, something closer to love. Captain Sarah Chen, 58 years old, who had served as the Resolute's tactical officer during its final active tour, 12 years earlier, was named to command her. She had gone on to a desk job at Fleet Command after the ship was decommissioned, spending the last decade pushing paper and attending meetings, and when the call came asking if she would take the Resolute back into space, she did not hesitate for even a second. Get me my old crew, she told Reyes over the comm. Whoever's left, whoever will come. And get that ship spaceworthy. We've got 28 days. 28 days to prepare a 53-year-old warship, crewed largely by people in their 60s and 70s, to fly out and meet the flagship of an empire that had conquered star systems for 4,000 years. Marcus Webb, watching the maintenance crews swarm over the Resolute's hull that night, patching, welding, testing systems that hadn't run in a decade, allowed himself a small, tired smile. Wake up, old girl, he murmured, resting a hand against her hull plating. One more fight left in you, I know it. Far above, unseen, a Korathi scout ship hung in the darkness beyond the orbit of Mars, its sensors quietly recording everything, relaying the data back across the stars, to a king, who was very curious to see what Earth would choose to send him. 28 days felt like both an eternity and no time at all. At Farside Station, the Resolute sat in her dry dock like an old soldier being fitted for one last uniform. Sparks rained down from welding torches at all hours. Robotic drones crawled across her hull, replacing plating that had grown thin with age, while human hands did the work that machines couldn't be trusted with. The delicate calibration of weapon systems, the rewiring of consoles that hadn't lit up in over a decade, the 1,000 small acts of care that turn a museum piece back into a warship. Marcus Webb never left the engine room, not for more than a few hours of sleep at a time. He directed the repair crews with the sharp, impatient energy of a man half his age, snapping at anyone who tried to modernize a system he considered sacred. No, he told a young engineer, who suggested replacing the manual backup controls with a new automated system. You leave that alone. That's not outdated, son. That's insurance. The day comes when every computer on this ship goes dark, and somebody's still going to need to fire that cannon by hand. That day has come before. It'll come again. The young engineer, whose name was Priya Anand, 26 years old and fresh out of the Fleet Academy, looked at him like he'd grown a second head. But she didn't argue. She had heard the stories about the Resolute, the way everyone at Fleet Command had heard them, half legend and half history, and she found herself wanting to understand the old ship rather than fix her. Tell me about the Belt conflict, she said instead, handing him a tool he'd been reaching for. The one where she got that scar on the port side. Marcus's hands paused on the wiring. For a moment, he looked very far away. That was the 3rd year of the war, he said. We were escorting a convoy of mining ships back from the Belt when we got jumped by 6 raiders. 6 against 1, and we were the only warship in range. Captain at the time, man named Holloway, he had two choices: run and let the convoy die, or stand and fight odds that no sane commander would take. What did he do? He stood, Marcus said simply. We took hits nobody thought this ship could survive. Lost the starboard weapons array in the first 10 minutes. Lost pressure in 4 compartments. I had 12 people in engineering with me, and by the end of it, 3 of them were dead, and I had third-degree burns on my hands that took a year to heal. But we didn't run, and neither did the raiders, not until we'd disabled 4 of their 6 ships, and the other 2 decided this fight wasn't worth finishing. He resumed his work, hands steady despite the memory. The convoy made it home. Every single mining ship. That's the thing about the Resolute, Priya. She's never been about winning pretty. She's about making sure the people counting on you don't die, whatever it costs. You remember that, and you'll understand why some of us old fools came back for one more tour. Captain Sarah Chen spent those 28 days doing something harder than repairing a ship. She was rebuilding a crew. Of the 240 people who had served aboard the Resolute during her final active tour, 186 were still alive. Of those, 131 answered the call. They came from farms in Nebraska and fishing villages in Norway, from retirement communities in Florida and research stations in Antarctica. Some were in their 80s, moving slowly, but with minds still sharp as knives. Others, like Chen herself, were younger, in their 50s and 60s, still fit enough to pull full-duty rotations. The youngest of the old crew, a woman named Dr. Amara Osei, who had served as the ship's chief medical officer, was 52. The oldest was a weapons specialist named Kenji Watanabe, 79 years old, who had lost his left arm in the same engagement that scarred the ship's hull, and now wore a prosthetic that he insisted, with a grin, shoots straighter than the original ever did. Chen filled the remaining positions with volunteers from the current fleet, younger officers and enlisted personnel who wanted to be part of history, who had grown up hearing stories about the Resolute the way children a century earlier had grown up hearing stories about old wooden ships that crossed oceans no one thought crossable. She paired every veteran with a younger counterpart, insisting that knowledge get passed down properly, not just absorbed through proximity. It made for strange scenes throughout the ship. An 81-year-old former navigator patiently teaching a 23-year-old ensign how to read the subtle vibrations in the deck plating that meant a stabilizer was about to fail, days before any sensor would flag it. Machines can tell you what's wrong, the old navigator told her protege, but they can only tell you what they're built to look for. This ship has been talking to her crew for 50 years. You just have to learn to listen. On the 20th day, General Petrov visited Farside Station to inspect progress. Still skeptical despite Reyes's confidence, he found Captain Chen on the bridge, running drills with a mixed crew of gray-haired veterans and nervous young volunteers, and he watched for nearly an hour without saying anything. What struck him most was not the technical proficiency, though that was considerable. It was the calm. Younger crews he had observed elsewhere in the fleet operated with a kind of tense, controlled energy, the sound of people executing a well-drilled procedure. The Resolute's crew felt different. There was an easiness to their movements, a lack of hesitation that came from people who had, in some cases, done this exact job under actual fire decades earlier, and simply never forgot how. "They're not nervous," he said to Chen afterward. "Why would they be?" Chen replied. "Most of my senior staff have already faced the worst thing that can happen to a person in this line of work. They've lost friends. They've been shot at by people who wanted them dead. A test from an alien king, no matter how intimidating he wants to look, isn't the scariest thing most of them have ever faced. That gives us an advantage most fleets don't have. We're not afraid of dying. We're afraid of failing the people counting on us, and that's a very different kind of fear. It makes you sharper, not weaker." Petrov left Farside Station that night less skeptical than he'd arrived, though he wouldn't fully believe until he saw it with his own eyes. On the 25th day, the Resolute left dry dock for the first time in 11 years. Marcus Webb insisted on being present in engineering for the moment the main reactor came online, refusing every suggestion that he watch from a monitor elsewhere. Priya Anand stood beside him, notepad in hand, as the old engineer ran through a startup sequence he still knew by heart despite not having performed it in over a decade. The reactor hummed to life with a low, steady thrum that Marcus felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled up through the deck plating and into his old bones, like the ship recognizing an old friend. "There she is," he whispered. On the bridge, Captain Chen watched her instrument panels light up one by one, systems that had sat dormant for years, slowly waking, reporting their status, confirming readiness. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not anxiety, but a quiet, fierce joy. "All systems nominal, Captain," reported her tactical officer, a 63-year-old former lieutenant named David Okonkwo, who had served under Chen during the ship's final tour, and had left a comfortable retirement in Lagos to be here. "She's ready." "Take us out," Chen said, nice and slow. "Let's remember how to do this before we go trying anything fancy." The Resolute eased out of dry dock under her own power for the first time in over a decade, moving with a grace that belied her blocky utilitarian design, and the crew that had waited so long to fly her again felt something shift in the air of the bridge, something like coming home. They spent the next 3 days running drills in the space around the moon, testing every system, pushing the engines through their paces, running weapons calibrations against target drones. The old ship performed better than anyone had expected. Not because her raw numbers had improved. They hadn't. Her weapons were still a generation behind current fleet standards. But because every system on her had been maintained and understood by people who knew exactly what she was capable of and exactly where her limits lay. "She's not the strongest ship in the fleet," Chen told her assembled senior staff on the final night before departure, standing in the briefing room with the weight of the coming test settled over all of them. "She never has been. But I've flown newer ships, better armed ships, and I've never trusted any of them the way I trust this one. Every person on this ship, veteran and volunteer both, knows their job. Every system has 3 backups. And most importantly, this crew has something no training simulation can teach, the certainty that comes from having already survived worse." She looked around the room, at the mix of gray hair and young, determined faces. "Threxul Vaughn wants to test our strength. He's going to get exactly what he asked for. He just doesn't know yet what that word means to us." 2 days before departure, a final piece of the puzzle arrived. Intelligence from Earth's listening posts, painstakingly assembled by analysts who had spent every waking hour since the King's message trying to learn everything possible about the Korathi Dominion. The report that reached Captain Chen's desk painted a troubling picture. The Korathi flagship, called the Ashenmaw according to intercepted communications, was estimated to be roughly 4 times the size of the Resolute, armed with weapons that could theoretically punch through Earth's best armor as easily as paper. Its crew were veterans of dozens of campaigns across a dozen star systems. By every conventional measure, it was not simply stronger than the Resolute, it was stronger than anything humanity had ever built or was likely to build within the next century. But buried in the analysis was something more interesting. A pattern the analysts had noticed in historical records the Dominion itself had inadvertently broadcast over the years. Boastful transmissions about past conquests, intercepted by deep space listening arrays. Every species the Korathi had tested and subsequently respected as an equal, rather than absorbed as a resource, had one thing in common. None of them had won their test through superior firepower. Every single one had won through resilience, adaptability, or unexpected cunning, surviving engagements they had no business surviving, and impressing the Korathi not with strength but with the refusal to break. "He's not testing our weapons," Chen said quietly, reading the report a second time. Marcus was right. Elena was right. "He's testing whether we deserve to exist as equals, and the only way to prove that is to show him what this species is actually made of." She set the report down and looked out the viewport at the stars beyond, at the black emptiness the Resolute would soon cross, carrying the weight of an entire planet's future in her old, scarred hull. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "let's go show him." 300 million kilometers away, at the edge of the solar system, a massive shape began to emerge from the darkness, its running lights blinking like distant, watchful stars. The Ashenmaw had arrived early, and King Threxul Vaughn stood on its bridge, staring at the sensor readings of the small, ancient vessel that Earth's fleet database identified only as the Resolute, and for the first time in a very long while, he found himself genuinely curious about what was going to happen next. The Resolute crossed the edge of the solar system on the 28th day, exactly as promised, and the crew got their first look at the Ashenmaw through the forward viewport. It was enormous. Where the Resolute was blocky and practical, a machine built for survival rather than beauty, the Ashen Maw was long and predatory, its hull the color of dried blood, covered in the same shifting symbols that had marked King Threxel Vaughn's armor. It dwarfed the Resolute the way a whale dwarfs a fishing boat, and for a moment, even the most battle-hardened veterans on the bridge fell silent. "Sweet Mother of God," murmured Okonkwo, staring at the tactical display. "That thing could swallow us whole." "Focus," Chen said, though her own pulse had quickened. "Hail them. Let's see what kind of welcome we get." The response came almost immediately, a hologram forming in the center of the bridge, King Threxel Vaughn himself, standing on what appeared to be the Ashen Maw's own bridge, surrounded by Karathi officers, who watched the transmission with an expression Chen could only interpret as amusement. "Captain," the king said, his translated voice carrying a note of genuine surprise, "I confess, this is not what I expected." "Your Majesty," Chen replied, keeping her voice level. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen, commanding the ESV Resolute. We're here as agreed, at the coordinates you provided." Threxel Vaughn studied her through the hologram, his golden eyes narrowing slightly. "I asked for your strongest warship. Your sensors are being transmitted to my vessel, as a courtesy of the arrangement, and my analysts inform me that the vessel you have sent is—" He paused, as if searching for a diplomatic way to phrase it. "Old. Older than any vessel your species currently maintains in active service, by a significant margin. Is this some manner of insult, Captain? Or does your species simply not understand the terms of my test?" Behind Chen, she could feel the tension of her crew, the held breath of 100 people waiting to see how this moment would unfold. She thought of Marcus Webb's words in the engine room, and of Elena Reyes standing before the council, and she chose her words carefully. "No insult intended, Your Majesty," she said. "You asked for the ship that best represents the might of our species. This is that ship. Not our newest, not our most heavily armed, but the one that has never, in 53 years of service, failed the people who depended on her. We didn't send you our best technology. We sent you our best proof." For a long moment, the king said nothing, and Chen wondered if she had miscalculated badly, if this answer would be taken as defiance rather than honesty. Then Threxel Vaughn laughed, a deep, rolling sound that echoed strangely through the translation system. "Proof," he repeated. "Interesting. Very well, Captain. Let us see what this proof of yours can withstand." The test, as it turned out, was not a single battle. It was 3 trials, spread across 3 days, each one designed to measure something different. Threxel Vaughn explained the terms with the detached precision of someone who had overseen this ritual many times before, for many different species, across 4,000 years of Dominion history. "The first trial measures endurance," he said. "My flagship will subject your vessel to a controlled bombardment, calibrated to a fraction of true combat intensity. We will observe how your ship and crew respond to sustained damage. The second trial measures adaptability. You will face a tactical scenario designed by my strategists, one with no clean solution. We will observe how you improvise. The third trial, should you survive the first 2, measures resolve. You will be given the opportunity to withdraw at any point during any trial. Those who withdraw are judged weak. Those who continue, regardless of the cost, are judged worthy of respect, whether they win or lose the final engagement." Chen relayed the terms to her crew, watching their faces as the weight of it settled in. Dr. Osei, the chief medical officer, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Calibrated to a fraction of true combat intensity. What does that actually mean for us?" "It means it's still going to hurt," Marcus Webb said over the comm from engineering, his voice grim. "A fraction of what that monster could really throw at us might still be more than this old girl's ever taken in one sitting, but she's taken plenty before. We just have to trust her." Chen nodded slowly, then keyed the ship-wide comm, her voice carrying to every corner of the Resolute, from the bridge to the engine room, to the cramped quarters where off-duty crew waited and listened. "This is the captain speaking," she said. "You've all heard the terms. I won't lie to you, this is going to be hard, and there's a real chance some of us don't walk away from it. But I need you to remember something. This ship has never been the strongest thing in any fight she's ever been in, and she has never lost. Not because we're lucky. Because every single person aboard her, then and now, refuses to let the people beside them down. That's what we're going to show this king today. Man your stations. Let's remind the galaxy what this old ship is made of. A cheer rose through the ship, ragged and fierce, from voices young and old alike. The first trial began at 0600 ship time. The Ashen Maw opened fire with weapons that lit up the darkness like a false dawn, streams of blue-white energy that struck the Resolute's shields and made the entire ship groan under the impact. On the bridge, consoles flickered, and alarms blared, as damage reports began flooding in from every deck. "Shields at 60%, called out the shield operator, a young volunteer named Ensign Torres, who had never faced live fire before in her life. Her voice shook, but her hands stayed steady on the controls. "Reroute auxiliary power to forward shields," Chen ordered. "Marcus, talk to me." "She's holding, Captain." Marcus's voice crackled back, tight with concentration. "Barely, but she's holding. I've got 3 backup systems compensating for shield strain. This is exactly what we built her for." The bombardment continued for 20 minutes, each wave more intense than the last, testing every system on the ship. Twice, sections lost power entirely, and twice, crew members who had trained for exactly this scenario switched to manual backup systems without hesitation, keeping critical functions online through sheer stubborn competence. Kenji Watanabe, the 79-year-old weapons specialist, manned his station with the calm of a man who had done this before, adjusting power distribution by hand when the automated systems lagged, muttering old prayers under his breath in Japanese between commands, exactly as he had during the Belt conflict 50 years earlier. When the bombardment finally ceased, the Resolute was scarred but intact, her shields depleted but not broken, her hull scorched in a dozen new places but never breached. Aboard the Ashen Maw, Threxel Vaughn watched the sensor data with an expression his officers had rarely seen on their king's face, genuine interest. "Impossible," muttered one of his tacticians, a Korathi officer named Vesic who had run these trials against 17 different species over his long career. "That bombardment should have crippled a vessel of that class within the first 10 minutes. Their shield technology is a full generation behind our own." "Their shield technology, yes," Threxel Vaughn said slowly, watching the readouts of the Resolute's internal systems, the constant, seamless rerouting of power, the redundant backups activating in perfect sequence, the crew working in a rhythm that spoke of decades of practice rather than mere training. But their engineering philosophy is something else entirely. Look at how they compensate. Every failure has 3 answers waiting behind it. This was not built by a species trying to build the strongest possible weapon, Vesic. This was built by a species that has learned, through hard experience, that survival matters more than strength. He leaned forward, studying the small, battered ship on his view screen, with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Prepare the second trial," he said. "I want to see what they do when there is no clean answer waiting for them." The second trial came the following day, and it was, as promised, a scenario with no clean solution. The Ashen Maw released 3 drone vessels, each one programmed to simulate a civilian transport under attack from hostile forces, represented by a 4th drone, armed with weapons the Resolute could not fully counter. The scenario's parameters were simple and brutal. The Resolute had limited time and limited resources, and could not possibly save all 3 simulated transports while also neutralizing the threat. Something would have to be sacrificed. Chen gathered her senior staff in the span of 90 seconds, the tactical display showing the unfolding crisis in cold, clinical detail. "Standard doctrine says we prioritize based on greatest number of simulated lives at risk," Okonkwo said quickly, running the numbers. "That's the transport with the highest passenger count. We commit everything there, and accept losses on the other 2. "That's the doctrine that gets studied in academy textbooks," Chen said, her mind racing. "But it's not the only answer. Marcus, can you give me a burst from the auxiliary thrusters? Something unconventional?" "You're thinking about using the ship itself as a shield, aren't you?" Marcus said, and even through the strain in his voice, there was a note of grim approval. "It's risky, Captain. We take that positioning. We're exposed to the threat drone's full weapons arc." "I know. Do it anyway." What followed was a maneuver that no Korathi tactical algorithm had predicted. Rather than choosing which transport to sacrifice, Chen ordered the Resolute into a position that placed her own hull directly between the threat drone and all 3 simulated transports simultaneously. absorbing the brunt of the simulated attack, while her weapons crew, coordinated by old Kenji Watanabe, with a precision that came from decades of muscle memory, picked apart the threat drone systems one component at a time, rather than attempting a single decisive strike. It was not elegant, it was not the kind of tactic that would win praise in a military academy, but it worked, and when the trial ended, all three simulated transports remained intact, the threat drone disabled, and the Resolute, though battered further, still standing. On the Ashenmaws Bridge, Vesic stared at the results in something close to disbelief. They refused the sacrifice, he said. The scenario was designed specifically to force a choice. There was no configuration in 17 previous trials where a species avoided losing at least one asset. Threxel Vaughn said nothing for a long moment, watching the small, scarred ship on his view screen make its slow way back to a defensive position, her crew already beginning damage control before the simulation had even fully concluded. They did not solve the puzzle I gave them, he said finally, a strange note in his translated voice. They refused to accept that it was a puzzle at all. They decided, instead, that no one under their protection would be left behind, and then they simply made that decision true, through force of will and stubborn skill. He turned to Vesic, and for the first time in the trial, something like genuine emotion crossed his ancient features. "Prepare the final trial," he said. "I believe I finally understand what Earth sent me. Now let us see if their resolve matches their cleverness." Aboard the Resolute, the crew had less than 12 hours to prepare for the third and final trial, and almost no information about what it would involve. Marcus Webb used every one of those hours in engineering, moving through the ship's systems with the focused intensity of a man who understood, better than anyone aboard, exactly how much the old vessel had already given and how little margin remained. The two previous trials had taken their toll. Shield generators ran hot, backup power reserves were depleted, a dozen small fires had been fought and extinguished across various decks, leaving scorched compartments and exhausted damage control teams in their wake. "How bad is it?" Chen asked him, finding him hunched over a diagnostic panel, Priya Anand beside him running calculations on a secondary display. "She's tired, Captain," Marcus said honestly. 53 years old and she's just taken 2 days of punishment. Most ships half her age wouldn't survive. I can get her combat ready for one more engagement, but I won't lie to you. If this final trial pushes her the way the first two did, she may not have much left to give afterward. Chen absorbed this, then asked the question that mattered most. "Can she fight?" Marcus looked at her, and something passed between them. An understanding built from decades of shared history with this ship, this crew, this fight. "She can fight," he said. "She was built to fight when everything else has already failed. That's exactly what tonight's going to ask of her." The third trial began without warning, as Threxel Vaughn had promised it would, testing not just the crew's skill, but their readiness under uncertainty. Sensors detected the threat first, not a simulation this time, but a real vessel, small and fast, emerging from behind the Ashenmaw's massive hull. Threxel Vaughn's voice came over the comm a moment later, grave in a way it had not been during the previous trials. "Captain Chen, what you are about to face is not part of my design. My sensors have detected a Kryvan raiding vessel entering this system, drawn, I suspect, by the energy signatures of our previous trials. The Kryvan are pirates, opportunists who prey on the weak and the wounded. They believe, correctly, that both our vessels have expended significant resources over these past 2 days. This is not a trial I have created for you. This is a genuine threat, and I offer you a genuine choice. Withdraw now, and no judgment will be made against your species for it. Or stand, and face a real enemy alongside my own vessel." On the bridge, every eye turned to Chen. She thought of Marcus's warning in engineering. She thought of the crew who had already given so much over the past 2 days, the burns and the bruises and the exhaustion written on every face around her. She thought of the 53 years of history behind her, the Belt conflict, the convoys saved, the crews that had always come home. "Threxel Vaughn," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the comm. 53 years ago, this ship was built by people who believed that walking away when someone needed help wasn't in our nature. We're not withdrawing. Point us at the threat." There was a pause, and when the king spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "Then let us fight together, Captain. Your positioning, if you would be so kind. My tacticians tell me your unconventional maneuvers have already proven more useful than our standard doctrine twice this trial. For the first time in the entire test, Chen allowed herself a small, fierce smile. Send me your sensor data. Let's see what we're dealing with. The Kryvan raiding vessel was smaller than the Ashen Maw but faster, armed with weapons designed to disable rather than destroy, the signature approach of pirates who preferred capturing valuable ships and crews over simply obliterating them. It struck first at the Resolute, correctly identifying her as the weaker and more wounded of the two vessels, launching a spread of disabling torpedoes designed to cripple her already strained systems. "Incoming!" Torres called from her station, and this time there was no shake in her voice, only the sharp focus of someone who had already faced worse over the past 2 days, and come through it. "Evasive pattern Delta 7, Chen ordered, calling on a maneuver from the ship's old combat archives, one that Marcus had insisted be kept in the ship's systems, despite decades of newer, supposedly more efficient alternatives. Kenji, target their torpedo guidance systems, not the torpedoes themselves. We can't outrun them, but we can blind them." Watanabe's weathered hands moved across his console with practiced precision, and moments later, the incoming torpedoes veered wildly off course, their guidance systems scrambled by a precisely targeted electronic countermeasure that the Resolute's 50-year-old systems had been quietly running in the background the entire time, an old trick from an old war that the Kryvan raiders, expecting a technologically outmatched target, had never anticipated. "Direct hit on their guidance array," Torres reported, disbelief and excitement warring in her voice. "Their torpedoes just went dark." On the Ashen Maw, Threxel Vaughn watched the exchange with growing fascination, even as his own vessel engaged the Kryvan raiders' primary weapons array, exchanging devastating blows with the pirate ship, in a display of overwhelming Dominion firepower. "Vesic," he said quietly, "that countermeasure. Cross-reference it against our archives." Vesic ran the query, and his expression shifted to something like astonishment. "Your Majesty, that technique appears in Dominion combat records from approximately 3,000 years ago. It was considered obsolete by our forces over a millennium before this species even developed spaceflight, and yet they deployed it with an efficiency that outperforms several methods currently in our active doctrine. They did not simply preserve an old technique," Threxel Vaughn murmured, watching the Resolute maneuver with a grace that belied her scarred, battered hull. "They understood why it worked, and they kept it alive, because they understood something my own forces have perhaps begun to forget. Sometimes the old ways endure not because they are ignorant of better options, but because they were built by people who had nothing to rely on except cleverness and each other. That kind of knowledge does not become obsolete, it only becomes rare." The battle raged for nearly 40 minutes, the Ashen Maw and the Resolute fighting in a coordination that surprised both crews, human tactics and Dominion firepower complementing each other in ways neither side had anticipated. The Kryvan raider, expecting an easy strike against a wounded target, found itself caught between overwhelming Dominion strength and human ingenuity that refused to behave predictably, refused to follow any doctrine the pirates had studied and prepared for. It was Marcus Webb, watching engineering readouts in real time, who spotted the opening that would decide the battle. "Captain, their engine core," he said urgently over the comm. "I'm reading a resonance pattern in their power signature, the same kind of instability I saw in Dominion engine designs back when we first started analyzing their tech during negotiations. If we can hit their core at the right frequency, we could trigger a cascade failure without needing to punch through their armor at all." "Can you calculate the frequency?" Chen asked. "Already did. Kenji, I'm sending targeting data to your station now." Watanabe received the data, made a small adjustment with hands that had aimed weapons for over half a century, and fired a single, precise shot, not aimed at the Kryvan ship's armor or weapons, but at a specific point along its hull, where Marcus's calculations indicated the engine core's resonance would be most vulnerable. The shot struck true. The Kryvan raider's engine core, already strained from the extended battle, buckled under the precisely targeted disruption, and the ship went dark, its weapons falling silent, its remaining crew left with no choice but to signal surrender, rather than face destruction adrift in the void. Silence fell across the Resolute's bridge, broken only by the sound of exhausted breathing and, somewhere behind Chen, someone quietly beginning to laugh with the particular giddy relief of people who had just survived something they weren't entirely certain they would. "Threxel Vaughn," Chen said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Threat neutralized. Requesting status on your vessel." The king's voice returned a moment later, and there was something in it that had not been present at the start of this journey, 3 days and a lifetime ago. "My vessel sustained damage, but remains fully operational, Captain," he said. "As for the Kryvan raider, their surrender has been accepted, and they will be dealt with according to Dominion law. But that is a matter for later." He paused. "Captain Chen, I have overseen 17 of these trials across 4,000 years of Dominion history. I have watched proud species send me their finest warships, vessels bristling with weapons far exceeding anything currently in your possession, only to watch those same vessels break, retreat, or fail when circumstances shifted beyond their carefully prepared plans. Your species sent me a ship that, by every measurable standard my analysts possess, should not have survived even the first trial." He paused again, and Chen found herself holding her breath, waiting. "And yet here you remain," Threxel Vaughn finished. "Scarred, exhausted, but unbroken, having just fought alongside my own flagship against a genuine threat neither of us anticipated. I believe, Captain Chen, that I finally understand what your council intended when they chose this vessel. I would like to speak with your leadership directly. There is much I wish to discuss." Aboard the Resolute, in engineering, Marcus Webb allowed himself to sit down for the first time in nearly 18 hours, his hands finally trembling, now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. And beside him, Priya Anand, 26 years old and forever changed by what she had just witnessed, looked at the old man with something close to awe. "You knew," she said. "This whole time you knew she could do this." Marcus managed a tired smile, resting his hand once more against the old, warm hull plating beside him, feeling the steady thrum of the reactor that had carried this ship and its crews through 53 years of history, through wars and peace and everything in between. "I didn't know," he admitted. "Not for certain. Nobody ever knows for certain, not really. But I believed. And sometimes, Priya, that turns out to be enough." 3 days after the final trial, the Resolute limped home to Farside Station, under her own power, scarred, scorched, and battered in ways that would take months to fully repair, but intact, and with every single member of her crew alive. News of what had happened spread across Earth within hours, pieced together from official council statements and the flood of personal messages that the crew, once finally within range of civilian communication networks, sent home to families who had spent 3 agonizing days not knowing whether their loved ones would return at all. Marcus Webb's granddaughter met him on the docking platform at Farside Station, crying before he had even fully disembarked, and he wrapped his still trembling arms around her and said nothing for a long moment, simply holding on, the way a man holds on when he has come closer to never seeing someone again than he ever wants to admit out loud. Captain Sarah Chen was met by Admiral Reyes herself, standing at the head of a small crowd of council members and fleet officers who had gathered to welcome the ship home. Reyes said nothing as Chen approached, only extended her hand, and when Chen took it, the older woman pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace instead. "You did it," Reyes said quietly. "You brought her home." "We all did," Chen replied. "Every single person on that ship. And her." She glanced back over her shoulder at the Resolute, sitting in dry dock once more, her scars fresh now instead of decades old, and felt something she couldn't quite put into words, a mixture of exhaustion and pride, and something like love for a machine that had, against every reasonable expectation, carried them all through to the other side. King Threxel Vaughn's formal address to the United Earth Council came 1 week later, delivered this time, not as a threat wrapped in a compliment, but as something closer to an apology, wrapped in genuine respect. He appeared once more as a hologram in the council chamber in Geneva, though his posture had changed subtly from their first meeting, the rigid formality replaced by something more relaxed, more curious. "When I issued my challenge to your species," he began, "I did so believing I already understood what I would find. In 4,000 years, I have tested 17 species before yours. Most sent me their most advanced technology, believing that raw power was the measure I sought. A handful understood, as your council eventually did, that something else mattered more. But none, in all those centuries, sent me a vessel with the specific history that the Resolute carries. None sent me a ship built not to demonstrate strength, but to prove endurance, and crewed not by those with the most to gain from victory, but by those who simply refused to let each other down. He paused, and even through the translation, something like genuine emotion carried in his words. I misunderstood your species at first contact. I believed you young and unrefined, a species that had not yet learned the lessons that shape truly great civilizations. I see now that I was mistaken, or perhaps only partially correct. You are young, yes. Your technology remains generations behind the Dominion's own. But the lesson I sought to test, the lesson that separates species worthy of standing among the recognized powers of this galaxy from those destined to remain resources for others, is not a lesson of technology at all. It is a lesson of character. And in that regard, Earth has proven itself not merely adequate, but exceptional. The council chamber was utterly silent, every member hanging on the king's words. Effective immediately, Threxulvon continued, Earth is recognized as a sovereign, equal power within the sector, governed by Dominion influence. Your territory will be respected. Your people will not be treated as a resource by the Korathi Dominion. Now or in any future I have the power to shape. Furthermore, I extend an invitation. The Resolute and her crew fought alongside my own flagship against a genuine threat, not a staged trial, and proved themselves capable allies in a moment that mattered. I would welcome the opportunity to establish formal diplomatic and, in time, military cooperation between our two civilizations, should your council find such an arrangement agreeable. Chairman Okafor, still visibly stunned by the reversal from existential threat to genuine offer of partnership, found his voice after a long moment. Your Majesty, he said carefully, on behalf of the United Earth Council, we would be honored to explore such an arrangement. Though I confess, I never expected our first alliance among the stars to begin with a 53-year-old warship and a very old engineer's stubborn refusal to let her go. For the first time in the entire proceedings, King Threxulvon laughed, and this time it carried no ambiguity at all, only genuine warmth. Chairman, he said, in my 4,000 years, I have learned that the most valuable alliances rarely begin the way anyone expects. Perhaps that stubbornness you speak of is precisely the quality that will serve both our peoples well in the centuries ahead. In the months that followed, the Resolute underwent the most extensive repairs of her 53-year history, not to modernize her beyond recognition, but to restore her, carefully and deliberately, to full operational strength. Marcus Webb oversaw every stage of the work personally, refusing retirement despite his advancing years, insisting that the old ship still had lessons to teach a new generation of engineers, who now flocked to study under him, drawn by stories of what she had accomplished. Priya Anand became his official apprentice, the first of what would eventually become a small but dedicated program within Fleet Command, dedicated to preserving what the old engineers called legacy engineering, the philosophy of redundancy, resilience, and hands-on understanding that had carried the Resolute through trials no modern vessel, built purely for maximum theoretical performance, could have survived. Captain Sarah Chen was offered a promotion to oversee the Dominion Liaison Program, coordinating the growing partnership between Earth and the Korathi Dominion, but she declined the desk position, choosing instead to remain in command of the Resolute for as long as the old ship continued to fly. When asked why, in an interview that would later become famous across Earth's media networks, she gave an answer that seemed to capture something essential about the entire experience. People keep asking me if we're going to build a new Resolute, she said. A modern version, with all the same values but better technology. And I understand the instinct. But I don't think that's the point. This ship isn't special because of what she's made of. She's special because of the 53 years of people who refused to give up on each other while serving aboard her, and the systems that were built, piece by piece, by people who had actually lived through disaster and decided never to be caught unprepared again. You can't manufacture that, you can only earn it, one hard year at a time. I intend to keep flying her until she truly can't fly anymore, because there's no replacing what she represents, no matter how advanced our next ship might be. Old Kenji Watanabe, finally retiring for good after the mission that had asked more of his 80-year-old body than perhaps any mission before it, spent his final years teaching marksmanship and tactics to young fleet cadets. always ending his lessons with the same piece of advice, delivered with the dry humor that had carried him through decades of service. Technology gives you options, he would tell them, but it's the person pulling the trigger, the person who's already faced fear and decided to stand anyway, who actually wins the fight. Never forget that. No matter how advanced your ships get, the galaxy is full of powerful weapons. It is not full of people who refuse to break. That is the rarer thing, and it is the thing worth becoming. A year after the trial, a small ceremony was held at Farside Station to commemorate the anniversary of the Resolute's mission, attended by surviving crew members, fleet officials, and, via hologram, King Threxel Vaughn himself, who had insisted on being present for the occasion, despite the vast distance separating Dominion space from Earth's solar system. Marcus Webb, now using a cane but still sharp-eyed and quick-witted, was asked to say a few words, and he approached the small podium with the same steady determination he had carried through every challenge of that long mission. 53 years ago, he said, this ship was built by people who had just come through a war that nearly tore our own planet apart. They built her, not to be the strongest ship anyone had ever seen, but to be the ship that would never let her crew down, no matter what came. For 53 years, she kept that promise. And when the entire future of our species hung on a single test, she kept it one more time. He paused, looking out at the assembled crowd, at the mix of old veterans and young cadets who had come to hear his words, at the old ship herself, visible through the station's viewport, finally fully restored and gleaming faintly under Earth's distant sun. I used to think strength was about what you could build, he continued. Bigger guns, thicker armor, faster engines. I don't think that anymore. I think strength is about what you refuse to abandon, even when giving up would be easier. This ship taught me that lesson twice in my life, once when I was young enough to still be learning who I wanted to become, and once again last year, when I was old enough that most people would have said my part in this story was already finished. He looked directly at Priya Anand, standing among the crowd of young engineers who had trained under him over the past year, and smiled. The story isn't finished, though. It never really is. Somewhere out there, whatever ship carries humanity's flag into whatever comes next, it will need people who understand that lesson, who are willing to build something worth trusting, rather than something merely worth admiring. I believe we have those people. I've met a good number of them this past year, and they give me hope for everything still to come. He raised his glass, and around him, the crowd of veterans and cadets, engineers and officers, humans and, via hologram, even the ancient king of a 4,000-year-old empire, raised their own in return. To the Resolute, Marcus Webb said, his voice carrying clear and strong across the gathered crowd. And to every old, stubborn, unglamorous thing that turns out, when it matters most, to be exactly strong enough. Far above them, beyond the station's viewport, the old ship sat quietly in her dock, scarred and rebuilt and ready, whenever she was needed, to prove once again that the truest strength a warship or a civilization could carry was never measured in weapons alone, but in the simple, stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind.